All right, good morning. It's about time to start. I know maybe we typically start a little bit later because of the radio show, but not going on today, so figure might as well start now. Looks like most everybody's here, so give us a little more time. We're going to try and cover a good bit of information today. So it's good to see you all again. If you haven't met me before, I'm Micah Chandler. I come down about once a month-ish and preach. Me and Mike Schmidt have sort of worked on it. An arrangement there. So sorry he can't be here today, so you got me twice. Today got me for class and the sermon today. But it should be good, hopefully. So every time I get to do the class and the sermon, I try and pick a topic that I can address in both hours, sort of connect both the studies that we do this morning. So this morning we're going to do that by studying John chapter 9 and John chapter 10. So you can go ahead and open your Bibles to John chapter 9. That's what we're going to be focusing on this hour for the class period. John chapter 9. And while you turn there, I'd just like to open up with a concept that's sort of going to be the theme of our study today, both in class and in the sermon hour. And that is, I'll just frame it this way. Have you ever asked yourself the question, or have you ever heard someone say the phrase, I would believe in God. I would believe in God if he just revealed himself more clearly to me. We ever heard that? Or maybe you've said that yourself, you know. It's sort of a fair statement, you might say. Well, I want to believe in God, even, and I would, but I just can't seem to find him anywhere. We hear that, I think, fairly often, probably. You know, I'm very open to the possibility, but it just doesn't seem like there's enough proof, enough evidence to warrant a belief in God. That's a fairly common phrase, and it sort of has a jargony term called reasonable non-belief. And it's sort of this idea that we've been talking about. I want to believe in God, I just can't seem to find him anywhere. People call it reasonable non-belief because they don't believe reasonably, right? It's a pretty self-evident term there. And so people have even used this idea as a proof against the existence of God. They've worked out a logistical syllogism, an argument. And it goes a little something like this. First premise is, if God exists, reasonable non-belief would not happen. And the reasoning for saying that premise is, well, if God exists and if he's so loving and if he really wants everyone to be saved, well, then God would make sure that anyone who wanted to believe in him would believe in him. Right? That's the logic that they use. If he really wanted everyone to be saved, then he would make himself so clear to people who wanted to believe in him, even to people who didn't want to believe in him, if he loves them so much, that reasonable non-belief wouldn't happen. But then the second premise, they say, but reasonable non-belief does occur. People do genuinely want to believe in God and can't seem to find a good reason to. And so therefore they say God can't exist, based on these first two premises. Right? So you look at this argument and, truth of the argument aside, it's a valid argument, right, logically. Not meaning that it's true, meaning that the form of the argument is valid. Right? If the first two premises are true, then the last conclusion has to be true. Right? But obviously, I think we would see a problem with this argument. Not in the form of the argument, but in the premises. And I think it's because you could argue that some of these premises are not as self-evident or not as true as some people who would claim this think they are. Because this argument assumes several things that are dangerous to assume and that we may take for granted. And I'll just list those assumptions real quick. Claiming that God wouldn't allow reasonable non-belief to happen, but it does happen, so therefore God doesn't exist. It assumes that I would know what a divine revelation looks like, right? Because in order to say, well, God should just reveal himself to me, then I would believe in him, I have to have some idea of what I'm talking about, right? And so it assumes that, well, if God did reveal himself to me in some way, I would recognize that as God, right? Oh, that's God, now I believe. That's what we're looking for, right? Well, that's a dangerous assumption, right? And that's not a given. We shouldn't take that for granted. And we'll see in this story we're about to read that that's not as given as we might think. God, in fact, does reveal himself to people and has revealed himself to people, and they haven't recognized it as God. And also, this argument assumes, sort of related to the first one, that I know who God is and what he does in some way, right? Because if I have some idea of what a divine revelation would look like, how God would reveal himself, then I must have some idea in my head of what I'm talking about. Once again, I must know something about God, something about who he is, something about the kinds of things he does that would identify him. And then finally, undergirding all this, we have to be open to the possibility of God in the first place, right? Open to the possibility of him existing in the first place. And so people can say, oh, I am open to the possibility of God, I just don't have proof. And people can say that genuinely. But we shouldn't be so naive as to think that people can say that not genuinely, right? Sometimes people can say, well, I'm open to the possibility of God, really meaning that they're not open to the possibility of God, right? And it's an easy phrase to hide behind. It can be, right? Not saying that everyone who says that isn't genuine. Certainly there are people who say that very genuinely. But there are also people who say that not genuinely. And so there's a story, I think, that illustrates the danger of all these assumptions and illustrates the danger of that argument. And that's in John chapter 9 and chapter 10. And it illustrates that we may take some of these for granted. And it shows how God might reveal himself and how we may react to that. So we're going to start by just working through John 9 this morning, and then in the sermon we're going to go through John chapter 10. So let's go ahead and just start reading. And just some background before we get into this chapter. This is in Jesus' life. He's in Jerusalem, and he's been in the temple for some time now, in John's account. And he's been giving these speeches, and he's sort of made a bad name for himself among some of the higher-ups, some of the Pharisees, right? And so immediately before this story, he's in the temple, and he's talking to the Pharisees, and he's on very, very bad terms with them, because he's just called them basically sons of the devil. You do works of the devil, your father is the devil, right? And then he uses the name I am that God uses in the Old Testament, right? At the burning bush, he says his name is I am. Jesus invokes that name on himself to identify himself with God. They're talking about Abraham and whether they're sons of Abraham or not. And Jesus mentions something about Abraham's day. And they say, oh, you're a young guy. Were you there when Abraham was alive? Sort of mocking him. And he tells them at the end of chapter 8, before Abraham was, I am. Very clearly identifying himself with that divine name there. And so what the Pharisees do to that is they pick up stones ready to stone him in the temple, right? And so Jesus gets out of there real quick. And so that's the background immediately preceding chapter 9. So he's going out of the temple right before the Jews are trying to stone him. So let's just pick up here in chapter 1, or verse 1 of chapter 9. As he passed by, that is coming out of the temple, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. And then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So it's an interesting opening to this story, right? They're coming out of the temple, and they see this blind man. And the apostles ask Jesus a question, and what is that question? What's the assumption that they're making in that question?
That he's Messiah, that he could work miracles.
That he could work miracles, yes, that's true. But even before that, when they're asking about the blind man, what are they indicating in that question about the blind man? What do they say? Who what? Who sinned that this man is blind? So what are they saying? What's the implication?
It's a punishment.
Yes, somebody must have done something wrong for this guy to end up like that, right? And that's an easy trap to fall into, but this story serves as a warning against that kind of thinking. And then Jesus counteracts that. What does he say the purpose for this man's sickness is?
To prove that he could do good things.
Yes, to prove that he could do good things, and specifically to display what? To show people what?
His power.
His power, in other words, God's power, right? He says, this man is actually sick to display the works of God. And so this gets back to this, is what we're talking about, God revealing himself. How does God reveal himself? Jesus identifies the purpose for this man's sickness right here is to reveal God in some way, through him. So that sets up this story, right? This theme of God will be revealed through this man's sickness and through the miracle that Jesus works through him, right? So that's important to remember. That's the purpose of Jesus doing this miracle of this man's sickness. And side note, we should also guard against that kind of thinking that the apostles fell into. That if something bad happens to somebody, it's out of punishment. Maybe, but that's not as much of a given as they assumed it was. So then Jesus does heal him, right? He does heal him, and it's sort of an unorthodox method, right? There's several problematic things about this. You think about Jesus, the man who often healed from long distances, right? Healed the ruler's daughter from a long distance. But here, this is up close and personal, right? To a disturbing degree, maybe. Spits on the ground, makes mud out of his spit. So this combination of spit and dirt in his hands, rubs it on the guy's face, right? Rubs it on the guy's eyes. So in the context of the old law, the Jewish law, what has Jesus just done to that man?
Anointed.
Yeah, he uses that word anointed. Yeah, that's true. And this is sort of an unorthodox use of that word. It's mostly used for kings and things, but what has he done to his body specifically? This is a vague question.
Put mud on it.
Put mud on it, and specifically what I'm getting at, this is a vague question, but he's made him unclean.
Yes.
Right, yeah. And cleanliness was a huge deal to the Jew in the old law, right? So already, this is kind of a controversial way of healing this guy. Not to mention, we haven't figured this out yet, but this is the Sabbath day, too, which we already know is a very big deal and gets Jesus into a lot of trouble with the Pharisees. So cleanliness is an issue here. The Sabbath day is an issue here. Lots of old law implications in even this healing method. It's kind of funny, he says, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. And we think, pool of Siloam must have been right by. It wasn't. When me and Josephine got to go to Israel a couple summers ago, we got to walk through Hezekiah's aquifer that he made in the Old Testament. And that water from that aquifer actually runs into the pool of Siloam. The pool of Siloam is about a half a mile down a hill from the temple. So you can imagine this scene, rubs mud on this guy's eyes, blind, right? He can't see. And then he says, go ahead and walk down to that pool and then wash it off, right? So just unorthodox in a lot of ways. Probably this blind guy with mud all over his face, wandering around, probably asking, for help to get down this hill to this pool. But he does it. He does it anyway. And he washes it off. He comes back clean. But it's just sort of a funny scene and very unorthodox and demonstrates something about the way that Jesus is revealing God. Yes, sir?
I may sidetrack you a little bit, but
That's okay.
I'll ask a question here. They missed the miracle in some cases, not this particular case maybe. They missed the miracle because they were looking for fault. They were looking for him doing it on the Sabbath. They were looking for something wrong to be done. This is the main reason people don't find God, is they don't look for him.
You're getting ahead of me, actually. You're not even sidetracking. You're getting to my main point. But yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
They're not looking for him.
And we'll see that pretty clearly, even in some of the things the Pharisees say later on.
And the second reason, even when they're looking for him, is ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
Paul says in the Romans, God's evidence is all around us. We see it by what's made. But we're not looking for it by what's made.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and that'll play out very clearly in this story. And very clearly Jesus will explain that in the next chapter. We'll see. Yes, ma'am.
Aren't we in ourselves evidence of God?
I think the Bible speaks to that, absolutely. But that's the thing, about this story, and we'll see in a moment, you can still deny that. Even, if we tend to see that as self-evident, the possibility to deny that is still there. But I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I think you're definitely right. So he sends this guy down, washes him, heals him. So that already tells us that the way God is being revealed through Jesus is unorthodox. And it's not what they're expecting. Right? So let's go ahead and read the next few verses, probably through 17. We'll pick up at verse 8. Verse 8 of chapter 9. And the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" And some said, "It is he." And others said, "No, but he's like him." And he kept saying, "I am the man." And so they said to him, "Then how were your eyes open?" And he answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' And so I went and washed and received my sight." And they said to him, "Where is he?" And he said, "I don't know." Right? I was blind. I couldn't see. I don't know where he is. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. And so the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." And some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was division among them. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" And he said, "He is a prophet." All right, so this section, so he goes down, he comes back up and sees people start figuring out that this has happened, right? And what's the immediate reaction of some of them?
Disbelief.
Yeah. Are you sure this really happened? Is this the guy, that we've known? Some people are like, yeah, it's him. Some people are like, just looks like him, I think. So immediately beginning to question the legitimacy of this. And, this isn't proof enough in itself,
And then that he did it on the Sabbath.
And then that he did it on the Sabbath. Yeah, that comes into play. I just love that question. Where is he? Where's the guy who did this? He's like, I just now am able to see, in case you forgot. So I don't know where he went. I didn't even see what he looked like. But yes, then the bad guys come in the picture. Right? Then the Pharisees enter. They say, this is a big deal. Let's take him to the Pharisees. And again, what's the background with Jesus and the Pharisees to this point? When he last saw them, they were trying to stone him, right, in the temple. Not that long ago at all. Probably the same day, or at least very close to it. And so immediately when they hear Jesus' name is involved in this, there's going to be bad intentions involved. So they bring him to the Pharisees. And so bad background. And they hear this tale of the miracle, right? And he says, this man put clay on my eyes, and I wasn't able to see from birth, and I've opened my eyes. And it's like, what should the reaction be? The natural reaction. Yeah, it's like, wow. I mean, this is something only God does, right? And that's an interesting point. All throughout the Bible, the only person who gives sight to the blind is God. No one else ever does it. So this is something that only God can do, right? The immediate reaction should be, this is God, right? That's the irony of this story. Their immediate reaction is the exact opposite of that. Why?
Because he's a man.
Because he's a man, and more specifically, what reason did they give in what verse is it? Verse 16. Doesn't keep the Sabbath. Right. This guy doesn't keep the Sabbath. I mean, sure, he, gave a man who was blind from birth his sight back, but he did it on the Sabbath day, right? So this cannot be God.
They were trying to figure it out, because they said, how can a man that is a sinner, so they're assuming that, if Jesus is a sinner, why is he doing miracles?
And that's the next logical question, right? Well, if it's not from God, who is it from, right? I mean, who else could do something like this? Who else does do something like this? In history, no one. Right? Yeah, Joe?
And it gets to your second point from earlier, they're assuming that they know what God will look like and what God will do.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about their preconceived notions about who God is and how he acts and what he does. Yeah, and what a divine revelation looks like. It's not this, right? It's not rubbing spit and mud on a guy's eyes on the Sabbath day. Right? That can't be right. And so, there's some fairness to that. We should give, it's not like we would be there and we would just immediately be like, oh, that's God, for sure. That would be difficult, right? I'm sure that would be difficult, especially coming from the religious background, the background that they did. So we should check ourselves the same way we check them. But at the same time, there were people who said, who else can do this but God, right? And we even hear that in the blind man's explanation. They say to the blind man, well, who do you think he is? And what does the blind man say? He's a prophet. Yeah. On the right track, at least. This guy has to at least be from God. Certainly not a sinner, at least in the sense that they were thinking of Jesus. And so, yeah, it's the great irony of this kind of story, where at the beginning Jesus says, I'm going to reveal God through this man. And immediately there's people who say, this can't be God. And the only reason they're saying that is because there's a good chance that it is, because this is the kind of work that only God does, right? They wouldn't even feel the need to say that otherwise. So it's a just very ironic story. It's one of the funniest, in my opinion. I took a class at Florida College on the Book of John, and my professor is a very serious sort of man. His name is Dr. McClister. I've never seen him laugh so much as when he taught this chapter, because it's just so ironic, because everything you see from the Pharisees is upside down. And of course, we have hindsight now to help us out. And so we'll talk about applying this to ourselves in a few minutes. But it is just a very ironic story. Any other comments on that before I move on to the next
How many
section?
blind men in the Old Testament were made to see?
Do you have an answer?
I think it's 0.
Okay, 0.
So they were seeing something new. They weren't seeing something that God had done before or would be in their repertoire of things that they looked for.
Right. And sorry.
It goes back to this, they weren't looking again. They weren't understanding.
Yeah, who their conception of God was completely off. Yeah, so they weren't even looking for the kind of God that Jesus was displaying. And even more than that, it didn't happen. That's a great point. Jesus was doing something that had never been done before, but was prophesied. Right? The prophets are filled with, he will give sight to the blind. Right? Isaiah, I forget the year of Jubilee chapter, but that was part of plenty of messianic passages, I should have written them down, talk about him giving sight to the blind. And so Jesus is fulfilling that in a way here. And even the act of spitting on the ground, it says he made clay with his hands. Who else formed things from clay?
Potters.
God, right? Yeah, potters do, yes. And God uses that allegory, actually, for himself. God did that, right? And so in many ways, Jesus is acting like a creator here. He's doing things that God does. He's bringing light out of darkness for this man, right? Forming things out of clay, giving sight to the blind. And so in that sense, it's obvious. In the sense that the Pharisees were thinking about, it was completely contradictory because of the conception they had of what a divine revelation would look like.
What they didn't realize was that Jesus came to fulfill the law.
Yeah, absolutely. And not in the way they expected.
It also means they didn't know the scripture, because Isaiah does say that the blind would be
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of played out again with leprosy. And Jesus points out to them that no Hebrew was ever healed of leprosy in the Old Testament, only Naaman the Assyrian.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, lots of things Jesus does are unique to him. All right, we'll move on for time's sake. Starting in verse 18. Starting in verse 18. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. They're dragging his parents into it now. And asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we don't know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. And therefore his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." And so still we have people investigating, this can't be true. They go and grab the guy's parents and drag him into this issue and say, "Was he really born blind, like you say?" And already, you see even the people are sort of turning against these Jews because of the whole irony of the situation. So they're like, ask him. He's a grown man. He can tell you all about it, right? Sure, he was blind, but just leave us out of this. And this again gets back to the idea of how much proof, as we think of it, is enough proof, right? This man was a blind beggar, clearly known to his neighbors because people identified him as the man that had been blind. But no, I need to go drag his parents into this and make sure he was blind from birth, right? This can't be the case. So that's a prevalent theme in this story. We'll move on to verse 24. Verse 24. So the Jews called the man back. For the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." So they say, "All right, maybe you were healed. All right, we'll concede that. But give glory to God, right? Don't give glory to this man. He's a sinner." Which I'm not sure how they justified that at all, right? And it's also so ironic because that guy is God, right? That's the whole point. Jesus is God. And so they're saying, all right, this guy may have healed you, but it had to be God, doing something crazy, and don't give glory to that guy because he's a sinner. Verse 25, he answered, Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." And they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And he answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are the disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." And the man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." And they answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" And they cast him out. So again, it starts off with this statement by the Pharisees. It's just completely one of the most ironic, backward statements they say. Give glory to God, not this man, for what happened to you. Maybe you really were healed, but don't give this man the credit. They refuse to believe that Jesus was God because, again, Jesus was doing things that they didn't think God did. It didn't fit their preconceived notions of who God was. So that's the whole point. He is God. And I love the blind man's statement to that. What does the blind man say? "I don't know if he was a sinner or not. All I know is I was healed." Right? "I didn't even see the guy." Right? He says, "All I have to go off of is what his voice sounded like and what he did. All I have to go off of is his works." And that'll be a big part in the next chapter of Jesus talking about how God reveals himself. What was the purpose of the man's sickness, back to the beginning of the chapter, that Jesus pointed out? To display the works of God, right? And the blind man's saying, "I don't know. I don't know who he is. I don't know about him. All I have to go off of is the works." And so from that, he sort of makes a pretty logical argument, honestly. But before that, the guy sort of teases them and is like, "Oh, are you going to become his disciple too? Why do you keep asking me how he did it? I already told you, just a second ago." And so he says, "Oh, well, you're his disciple, right? We're the disciples of Moses. So you may follow him, but we know where the law came from Moses, right? God spoke to Moses. But as for this guy, we don't know where he comes from." That's the most revealing thing they say this whole time, right? That's the problem. They don't know where he comes from, but they should. And the blind man points that out. These works, who else could they come from, right? People have already asked them that. Could a sinner do such works? So obviously these works point back to God. But they say, we don't know where he comes from. Right? That reveals what they're thinking about. It reveals those assumptions that we already discussed. Right? They think they know what a divine revelation would look like. This wasn't it in their minds. They know that they think they know something about who God is and how he acts, and it's not like this, right? And they're open, they probably think they're open to a possibility of a different kind of God than they already have in their minds. They're absolutely not, right? Because this doesn't fit it. And so all these assumptions are at play here. And then the man says, "Oh, you don't know where he comes from, and yet he healed my eyes." Well, that's crazy. And he makes this pretty logical argument, right, to them. No man before has ever opened the eyes of the blind. Therefore, if this guy wasn't from God, he wouldn't be able to do it. But he did. So therefore what? What's the implied conclusion?
He must be from God.
He must be from God, right? And you even see a progression in the blind man's thinking about Jesus, at least in how he talks about it. Because what did he say Jesus was before when they asked him, "Who do you think this man is?" Prophet, right? He at least, speaks on God's behalf, maybe, in the general sense. What does he say now? Directly from God, right? He's from God, And earlier when the Pharisees asked him the question, "Is this man a sinner or not?" He kind of says, "Well, man, I don't know. I don't know about it." But here we see he actually thinks differently. He does know something about it. Just from the works, right? The works of Jesus testify that he must be from God. There's no other way, right? It's impossible. And once again, we always have hope for the Pharisees that maybe a logical argument like this, might hit them. And they say, bah, well, what do they say to him? In verse 34. You were born in utter sin, right? And you would teach us, right? We're the disciples of Moses, right? You're just a blind guy. And you were born in utter sin. What are they also implying there?
That he was blind because he was either from sin or sin.
Yeah, the same mistake the apostles were making at the beginning, right? You were born in utter sin, and the way your sickness reveals that, right? And you're going to teach us about something? Yeah, again, so much irony in this story.
Well, they were spiritually blind.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's one of the great themes of this story, which we'll get to in a second, the theme of darkness and blindness, and what's really going on with that in this story. Any other comments on that before we, yeah, Andrew?
I would say just a story. I mean, it is kind of funny, but it's also sad. I think Jesus is purposefully pitting the two things against each other. That, in order to cure literal blindness, which should be impossible to cure, all he needs is his words, a little bit of spit, and a little bit of dirt. But then in order to cure spiritual blindness, not even the miracles he's done beforehand, not even the evidence of a man, the evidence of his parents, the evidence of people who saw it, can convince somebody to see Jesus for who he is. I mean, the thing that should be impossible to heal takes that much, and the thing that should be so easy to, see, not even all the evidence in the world.
That's a great point. Yeah, and at a certain point, because healing that man's physical blindness, that was Jesus' choice, right? And that man couldn't, by his choice, heal himself. Right? That was the whole problem. The spiritual blindness, at least insofar as acknowledging Jesus as God, who was that up to? Yeah, that was up to them, right? That was up to them, and that was up to the blind man, right? And the blind man could have denied that Jesus was from God, but he didn't, right? Because he made that choice. He let the evidence and the works of Jesus lead him to that. Didn't drag Jesus' parents into the equation to say, how did this work, or I don't know, whatever happened there. But yeah, that's a really good point. And part of why we mess that up is because it's up to us, to acknowledge Jesus as God. And at a certain point, yeah, you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter how much evidence there is. If you don't want to see God for who he is and you only want to see him for what you think he should be, then you're not going to see him, ever. And Jesus talks more about that in the next chapter. So real quick, we'll just read this last section of the chapter, starting at verse 35. So they cast the blind man out of the temple, and Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." And he said, "Lord, I believe," and worshipped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." And some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Oh, are we also blind?" And Jesus said to him, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." So Jesus finds the guy again. He says, reveals who he is, right, clearly. And this man acknowledges him as such, right? And so we see these themes, just in conclusion, I'll put it these themes. One man we see coming out of darkness, right? One man could not see, and his eyes were opened, and he also came out of spiritual darkness, right? And he acknowledges Jesus as the Christ. But then the others, who could see perfectly fine, right? They could see Jesus standing there, doing these works, hearing the words he was saying. They go deeper into the darkness that they're already in. They refuse to acknowledge Jesus as the Christ. And really, verse 39 sums up the whole story. Jesus says, "For judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see." Right? That's the blind man. You saw, you didn't see, and now you see, physically and spiritually. And those who see may become blind. Those who think they know everything, those who think they know who God is, that they may become blind. And that's exactly what happens in this story. So one man comes out of darkness.
I think there's an important part of that.
Yes, sir.
The author take note of. He worshipped him. What was the result? Jesus did not say get up like the apostle. He accepted that worship. in that passage that we often don't take note of.
Yeah.
Though he said, do you believe in the Son of Man, which is probably more of a reference to his role as a prophet than a deity, but still he accepted worship.
Yeah.
And a question that we all should go home asking, at least I think so. Why do you believe? What evidence do you have? You're not going to have evidence like what these men saw. Why do you believe? I mean, and they didn't understand it because they were ignorant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point.
Don't let your ignorance get in the way. This world around us is so complex it cannot possibly have happened by chance. There's evidence of design and of God in almost everything we see. There's the history of the prophets. If you don't know world history, you can't see what Daniel is prophesying on a lot of the other prophets. If you don't look at the history of Israel, look for these things. Go read about them. Your faith is going to be increased. And then what's going to happen? What's God looking for? Your faith is measured by what you do.
That's a great point. Yeah, and exactly, you're right. It does end with that question. Why? Why? And, in a couple different senses, why did the Pharisees not believe? What was the barrier there? Why did the blind man believe, right? And what should that do to us? And when we think about God revealing himself to us, how does he reveal himself to us? And what mindset should we come into the search for God with? And we'll talk about that in the next hour. So we'll conclude right here. But yeah, just a great point to review these assumptions that we made at the beginning, right? Would I really know what a divine revelation looks like if it happened to me? Am I so certain in that? Right? And do I really know who God is and how he acts? And am I open to the possibility of God at all? Or open to the possibility of a God who's different than I may assume he is? Right? These are questions we need to bring a lot of caution into. And so this question of why did the Pharisees not believe and why did the blind man believe, Jesus explains very well in the next chapter, which we'll get into in the next hour. But we are about done and probably have 30 seconds left. So we'll end right there, and thank you for your attention.